You are listening to PastThink.com audiobook. Please like and subscribe, thank you. Chapter 53. Ningua house sacrifices to the ancestors on New Year's Eve. And Rongua house entertains the whole family on 15th night. Seeing that Skybright's repair of the peacock gold snow cape had so utterly exhausted her, Bao Yu called in a junior maid to help massage her, and for a while they pummeled her between them. After that they all went to bed, but in less than no time it seemed to be broad daylight, and they had to get up again. Instead of going straight off to his uncle's, however, Bao Yu first sent someone to summon Dr. Wang. The doctor arrived promptly and proceeded to take Skybright's pulses. He appeared to be disconcerted by what he found. Yesterday she seemed to be a little better, he said, but this pulse today takes us right back to where we started from, empty, superficial, faint, constricted. Now why should that be? She must have been eating or drinking too much. Either that, or she has been worrying about something. The original attack was not a serious one, but failure to take care of oneself after perspiration has been induced can be very serious. He went outside and wrote another prescription, which was presently brought into Bao Yu. Bao Yu noticed that the sudorifics and decongestants of the earlier prescription had been omitted, and restorative drugs to increase the vitality and nourish the blood, such as lycoperdon, nipplewort, and angelica, had been substituted. He gave instructions for the medicine to be made up immediately. He seemed distressed. This is dreadful. If anything should happen to you after this, I shall never forgive myself. Skybright, lying back on her pillow, hooted derisively at his concern. My dear young master, just get on with your own affairs and don't worry about me. I'm not about to go into a decline, I assure you. Bao Yu was in any case obliged to go now, but having held out at his uncle's place until the afternoon, he managed to get back to her by pretending that he was feeling unwell. Skybright was certainly quite ill. Fortunately she was normally an active, lively sort of girl, not given to moping and vapors. She had always been sensible, even abstemious, in her diet, and her constitution was a sound one. The Jias were great believers in the virtues of fasting. Masters and servants alike were put on a starvation diet at the slightest hint of a cough or cold, the physic and nursing they received being considered of only secondary importance to this, and Skybright had been fasting now for 2 or 3 days, ever since the influenza began. In addition to this, she had taken her medicine regularly and, except for the one night's lapse, had looked after herself reasonably well. Although the overexertion set her back a few days, she was soon on the mend again. And as the new catering arrangements whereby the cousins now ate in their own apartments made ordering things much easier, Bao Yu was able to get all sorts of soups and broths made up to aid her recovery. Omitting details of this convalescence, our story passes on to the return of Aroma, which occurred shortly after her mother's funeral. As soon as she got back, Musk told her all about Trinket, and how Skybright had dismissed her first and reported the dismissal afterwards to Bao Yu. Aroma merely remarked that Skybright had been too hasty, but made no further comment. Li Wan had herself now fallen a victim to the season's cold. Lady Xing was suffering from an inflammation of the eyes which necessitated Ying Chun's and Xiao Yan's attendance on her both mornings and evenings to dress them for her. Mrs. Li had been invited to spend some days with a younger brother, and gone off taking Li Wen and Li Qi with her, and Bao Yu was preoccupied with Aroma, who was still thinking constantly of her mother and liable at any moment to break down, as well as with Skybright, who had still not entirely recovered. So what with one thing and another, no one felt much in the mood for writing poetry, and 1 or 2 of the club's fixture days went by without a meeting. It was now well into the 12th month and Lady Wang and Shifeng were busily preparing for the new year. The season of appointments brought news that Wang Ziting had been promoted to the post of Inspector General of Armies in the 9 provinces, and that Jia Yucun was to become Undersecretary to the President of the Board of War with occasional duties at court. Over in the Ning mansion, cousin Jin had opened up the Hall of the Ancestors, and set his people to work sweeping it, setting the vessels out in readiness for the New Year sacrifices, and welcoming the spirits back into the ancestral tablets. He also had the main hall of the Ningua mansion swept in readiness for the annual ceremonial hanging of the ancestral portraits. Everyone in both mansions, both high and low, was in a fever of activity. One morning in the course of these preparations, as Yusher, who had not long since risen, was, with the assistance of Jia Rong's new wife, getting the presents of newly made clothes ready for sending to grandmother Jia, a maid came in bearing a trayful of New Year medallions. "It's from Mary, ma'am. He says that loose silver you gave him the other day was of several different marks, but the total weight was 153 taels and 13 pennyweights, and he says they've managed to make 220 medallions from it." She held out the tray for Yusher to inspect. On it there were medallions shaped like plumflowers, crabflower-shaped medallions, medallions with heart's desire rebus patterns of ingot, brush and scepter, and others with patterns of auspicious flowers. "Yes," said Yusher, "they seem to be all right. Tell him to take them inside immediately." The maid went off to do her bidding. Shortly after that, cousin Jin came in to have his lunch, and Jia Rong's wife hurried out to avoid him. "Have we received the bounty money for the New Year sacrifices yet?" cousin Jin asked Yusher when they were alone together. "I sent Rong to draw it this morning," said Yusher. "It's not that we rely on the money exactly," said cousin Jin, "but it is after all the gift of the emperor, and I think we ought to draw it as soon as possible, and get it across to Lady Jia so that it can be used to pay for the offerings. It's a double blessing when the gracious favor shown us by His Majesty can be passed on to the ancestors. However many thousands of our own we were to spend on them, it wouldn't do them nearly as much honor as these offerings subsidized by the imperial bounty, not to mention the advantages that we enjoy as recipients of imperial favor. And we have to remember that apart from the one or two great families like ours who don't really need this money, there are many, many families of poor hereditary officials who do actually depend on it for their ancestral sacrifices, and who wouldn't be able to celebrate New Year properly without it. So you see, it really was extraordinarily benevolent and far-seeing of the dynasty to institute this annual bounty." "Yes, indeed," said Yusher. "Master Rong is back," a servant came in to report, while the two of them were still talking. "Tell him to come in," said cousin Jin. Jia Rong entered carrying a little yellow bag, not as one would normally carry a bag, but holding it in both hands at shoulder height. "You've been a long time, haven't you?" said cousin Jin. Jia Rong smiled nervously. "This year they're not paying it at the Board of Rights any longer, but at the treasury of the Imperial Victuallers, so having first gone to the Board of Rights, I had to go from there all the way to the Imperial Victuallers to draw the money. The people at the Imperial Victuallers office all asked after you, by the way. They say they haven't seen you for a long time, but they often think about you." "It's not me they think about but my things," said cousin Jin with a dry smile. "Either that, or they are hoping for an invitation to come round over the new year." He was inspecting the yellow bag as he said this. It had a sealing slip with the words, "Perpetual Bounty," written on it in large characters. On the other side was the chop of the Department of Sacrifices of the Board of Rights, and some columns of smaller characters. Annual grant awarded in perpetuity to Jia Yan, Duke of Ningua, and Jia Yuan, Duke of Rongua, for New Year sacrifices, goods to the value of taels net cash received by Jia Rong, Captain, Imperial Bodyguard, Inner Palace, on date. Issuing officer for the year, name. This was followed by a cipher in red ink. After inspecting the yellow bag, cousin Jin had his lunch, then, when he had washed his hands and rinsed his mouth out, he changed into formal hat and boots and, ordering Jia Rong to follow him with the bag, set off for the other mansion to report the arrival of the bounty money, first to grandmother Jia and Lady Wang and then to Jia Shi and Lady Xing next door. When they got back he took out the money and ordered the bag to be carried into the hall of the ancestors and burnt there in the great incense burner in front of the ancestral tablets. There were further orders now for Jia Rong. "I want you to go and ask your Aunt Lien whether she's decided yet on which days she'll be entertaining in the new year. If she has, get the office to make out a good, clear list of the dates, so that we don't have any duplicating this year. Last year several families got invitations from both of us for the same day, and of course, people being what they are, instead of realizing that it was a mistake, they assumed that we had deliberately worked it out between us as an economy. Jia Rong hurried off to see Shi Feng, returning presently with the list of dates that his father had asked for. After running his eye over it, Cousin Jin handed it to a servant. Give this to Lai Sheng. Tell him to avoid these dates when he sends out our New Year invitations. He and Jia Rong went on to inspect operations in the hall, where a number of pages were carrying in and arranging the large screens on which the portraits of the ancestors were to be hung, and cleaning and polishing the tables, and the ritual vessels of gold and silver which were to be set up in front of them. While they were thus engaged, a page came in holding a red greetings card, and a schedule containing some sort of list. Bailiff Wu from Black Mountain Village, sir. He's just arrived. That old rascal, said Cousin Jin. He's been long enough getting here. Jia Rong took the greetings card and schedule from the servant, and opening up the card, held it out for his father to read. Cousin Jin folded his hands behind his back and bent over to read the inscription. Wu Jinxiao, bailiff, presents his humble compliments to the master and mistress, and compliments to the young gentlemen and ladies. Wishing you wealth, health and prosperity, increase of pay and promotion, and all your heart's desire in the coming year. Cousin Jin laughed. These country people have an original sense of style. Never mind the style, said Jia Rong, echoing his father's laughter with obsequious laughter of his own. Just think of all the good luck he is wishing us. He opened up the schedule and held it out while Cousin Jin ran his eye down the list. Tufted deer, 30. Water deer, 50. Spotted deer, 50. Siamese pigs, 20. Scalded pigs, 20. Wild boar, 20. Wild pigs, 20. Salted pigs, 20. Wild sheep, 20. Goats, 20. Scalded sheep, 20. Sheep, salted and fell, 20. Sturgeons, 200. Fish, various, 200 catties. Live chickens, ducks and geese, each, 200. Dried ditto, each, 200. Pheasants and hares, each, 200 brace. Bear's paws, 20 pairs. Deer's sinews, 20 catties. Sea slugs, 50 catties. Deer's tongues, 50. Ox tongues, 10. Dried mussels, 20 catties. Filberts, pine nuts, peach kernels, almonds, each, 2 bags. Crayfish, 50 pairs. Dried shrimps, 200 catties. High-quality selected silver frost charcoal, 1,000 catties. Medium-grade ditto, 2,000 catties. Red charcoal, 30,000 catties. Red emperor rice, 5 bushels. Green glutinous rice, 60 bushels. White ditto, 60 bushels. Powder rice, 60 bushels. Millet, sorghum and other grains, each, 60 bushels. General purpose rice, 2,500 bushels. Dried vegetables. 1 cartload. Item, total realized from sales of livestock and cereals. 2,500 taels silver. Item, present for the young ladies and gentlemen pets. 1. 2 deer. 4 pair white rabbits. 4 pair black rabbits. 2 pair golden pheasants. 2 pair foreign ducks. Bring him in, said Cousin Jin when he had finished perusing the schedule. Wu Jinxiao promptly appeared. He knelt down in the courtyard below, and had already kowtowed, and called out his greetings before Cousin Jin could have him raised up and brought into the hall. You are still hale and hearty then? Cousin Jin asked him. Yes, sir, thank you, sir, said the old man, beaming. I still manage to get about. Your sons must be quite big fellows by now, said Cousin Jin. Why don't you let them do the traveling for you? To tell you the truth, sir, I'm so used to the journey, I'd miss it now if I wasn't to come. Shouldn't know what to do with myself. The boys would be only too glad to come if I'd let them, of course, see what it's like here in the Emperor's shadow, as we say, but they're only youngsters yet. I'd be afeard of them having some mishap on the way. A few years longer and I shan't need to worry. How many days have you been on the road? Said Cousin Jin. Well, sir, as you know, there was a lot of snow this year. It must have been lying 3 or 4 foot thick in places. And that sudden thaw we had coming on top of it made the going very difficult. That must have put us back several days. It's taken a month and 2 days altogether. But I do assure you, sir, seeing that the time was running out and knowing how anxious you'd be, we made as much speed as we could. I was wondering what could have made you so late, said Cousin Jin. Well, I've been looking at this list of yours. I see you're holding out on me again this year, you old devil. Wu Jinxiao advanced a couple of steps, springing, as it were, to his own defense. It's like this, sir. The harvests this year have been really terrible. From the 3rd month to the 8th month it rained on and off all the time. I doubt we had 6 fine days in a row together. Then in the 9th month we had hail as big as teacups. For 50 miles around, the damage to crops and livestock, and houses and people as well, for that matter, was terrible. That's why I haven't brought you more this year. That's the honest truth, sir. You know I wouldn't lie to you. I'd reckoned on your bringing me at least 5,000 taels, said Cousin Jin, frowning. What am I supposed to do with an amount like this? We have only 8 or 9 farms now, and of those 8 or 9 2 have declared themselves disaster areas this year, and aren't contributing anything. With you holding back on me too, I might as well give up celebrating New Year altogether. Your lands have done better than some, said Wu Jinxiao. Take my cousin's place. That's only 30 miles from where I am, but my word, what a difference. My cousin manages 8 farms for your relations at the other house. They've got several times as much land as you, but the victuals he's brought them this year are no more than this lot here, and their cash yield on sales is no more than 2 or 3,000. Now they really have got something to make a fuss about. It's true, said Cousin Jin. We're not too badly off on this side. At least we haven't got any new major commitments outside our regular annual expenditure. For us it's a question of spending a bit more freely when we're flush and economizing a bit when things are tighter. And even in the case of these New Year expenses, I suppose I could cut down on them if I really had to. It would simply be a question of brazening it out. But with our Rongwa cousins it's different. They've had all these new expenses during the past few years, none of which were optional, but no new source of income to set against them. Which means that for the past year or 2 they've had to start eating into their capital. If you folk can't help them to make up the deficit, who else is there they can turn to? I know they've got a lot on their plate, said Wu Jinxiao with a knowing smile, but it can't all be outgoings, can it? There must be something coming in as well. Surely Her Grace and Old Live Forever must give them a handout once in a while? Cousin Jin turned to Jiarong with a laugh. You heard that? Rich, isn't it? Jiarong tittered. What does a countryman like you living at the back of beyond know about such matters? You don't suppose Her Grace has handed them the keys of the Emperor's treasury, do you? She's not her own mistress, even if she wanted to. She does give presents, of course, but it's only on birthdays and feast days, and the like, and never more than a few lengths of figured satin, or some curios or knickknacks. Even when she gives money, at the very most it will be 100 gold. Now say 100 gold is worth 1,000 silver taels, it can't be much more than that. What possible good can 1,000 taels do them, when during each of the past 2 years they've been forced to draw on their capital to the tune of several thousands a year? During the first of those 2 years they had the visitation, including the building of that great garden. Just imagine what that must have cost them. Another 2 years like these last 2 with another visitation thrown in, and they'll be cleaned out. These simple country souls see the bright outside, but not the dark within, said Cousin Jin. The situation our Rongwa cousins are in is like the proverbial chime hammer made of philodendron wood, imposing to look at, but bitter inside. You can tell they really are hard up, said Jiarong half-jokingly. The other day I heard Auntie Lian plotting with Faithful to steal some of Lady Jia's things to use as security for a loan. No, I think that was merely our phone being her usual artful self, said Cousin Jin, laughing. They're still not that poor. I expect she has noticed how much they have been spending beyond their means, and is planning some economy or other. What you overheard would simply have been her way of letting people know how hard up they are and preparing them for some cuts. I've got a rough idea of how their finances stand at present, and I assure you that they aren't quite as desperate as that yet. Concluding the conversation on this more reassuring note, Cousin Jin gave Wu Jinxiao into the charge of the servants with instructions that he was to be properly looked after and entertained. Our narrative does not follow the old man into the servants' quarters, however, but remains in the hall with Cousin Jin. Cousin Jin had a portion of the things that Wu Jinxiao had brought set aside to be used as offerings to the ancestors. He had another portion set aside for sending to Rongwa House, and while Jiarong attended to its delivery, he personally supervised the selection of a third portion which he intended to keep for his own use. What remained he had piled up in orderly heaps on the pavement beneath the hall terrace to be shared out among the junior members of the clan, who were forthwith invited to come and collect their shares. At that point a large consignment of things arrived from the other mansion, most of them things to be used in the ancestral sacrifices, but some of them for Cousin Jin himself. Having given orders for their disposal, Cousin Jin went back to his supervision of the polishing and furniture shifting in the hall. When that work was completed, he put on a lynx skin coat and went out, still in his slippers, onto the terrace, where, having found himself a warm place under the eaves, he got the servants to spread out a wolfskin rug for him so that he could sit there and watch the young clansmen as they came to collect their shares. He noticed that Jia Qin was among them. "What are you doing here?" he called out to him. "Who told you to come?" Jia Qin came over and stood in front of him, arms held submissively at his sides. "I heard that you were having a family share-out, uncle, so I came along without waiting to be called. These things I'm giving away now are intended for those of your uncles and cousins who haven't got jobs or private incomes to support them," said Cousin Jin. "During the years when you were unemployed yourself, I used to give you a share of the New Year things. But you aren't unemployed now, you've got that supervisor's job that my Rongwa cousins gave you, looking after those young nuns in the family temple. Not only have you got a salary of your own, but you control all the nuns' allowances as well. Yet still you come here for my things. You are too greedy. And just look at you. No one would think from your appearance that you had money to spend and a responsible position. You used to have the excuse that you had no money, but what excuse have you got now? You look even more disreputable now than you did when you were unemployed." "I've got a big family to support," said Jia Qin. "I have a lot of expenses." "Humbug," said Cousin Jin. "I know what you get up to in that temple of yours, don't think I don't. Once you set foot in that place, you are the master and nobody there can gainsay you. With money to spend and the rest of us a long way away in the city, you can do exactly as you like. invite the local riff-raff in every night to gamble with you, and fill the place with your kept women and fancy boys. So having squandered all the money, and reduced yourself to the disgraceful state I see you in now, you have the effrontery to try and get something out of me. All you are likely to get out of me, young man, is a good stout stick across the shoulders. And when this holiday is over, I shall make it my business to have a word with your Uncle Lien, and see to it that he has you recalled. Cao Xueqin reddened, but dared not say anything. A servant came up then to report. Someone with a present from the Prince of Beijing, Sir, 2 scrolls and a perfume bag. Cousin Jin turned to Jia Rong. Go and entertain him for me. Tell him I'm out. Jia Rong hurried off. Cousin Jin then dismissed Cao Xueqin, and having presided over the distribution until all the things had been taken, returned to his own apartment to have his dinner with Yusher. Concerning the rest of that day, and the night which followed, our narrative is silent. The day after that was even busier. But to give further details of these preparations would be tedious. Suffice it to say that by the 29th of the 12th month they had been completed. In both mansions new door gods had been pasted up on all the doors, the inscribed boards at the sides and over the tops of gateways had been repainted, and fresh good luck slips, auspicious couplets written in the best calligraphy on strips of scarlet paper, had been pasted up at the sides of all the intrench. In the Ningua mansion the central doors of the main outer gate, of the ornamental gate, of the outer reception hall, of the pavilion gate, of the inner reception hall, of the triple gate dividing the inner from the outer parts of the mansion, and of the inner ornamental gate, were all thrown open, so that a way was opened up from the street right through into the family hall inside. Red lanterns on tall scarlet stands lined either side of this route. At dusk, when the candles in them were lit, they took on the appearance of 2 long, parallel serpents of light, undulating slightly where they ascended or descended the steps of terraces. Next day, the last of the old year, Grandmother Jia, and any of the Jia ladies who possessed patents of nobility attired themselves in the court dress appropriate to their rank, and were borne in procession to the palace, Grandmother Jia at the head in a palanquin carried by 8 bearers, to make their kowtows to the imperial concubine, and felicitate her on the successful conclusion of the year. On their return from the banquet which she gave them, their chairs were set down outside the pavilion gate of the Ningua mansion, where those of the younger Jia males who had not escorted them to the palace were lined up on either side of the gateway waiting to receive them. When the ladies had all alighted, the young men conducted them on foot to the Jia family's Hall of the Ancestors. Bao Qin had never been inside this part of the mansion before. She was being allowed in on this occasion by virtue of her recent adoption into the family, and was anxious to take in every detail, in order that she might retain as accurate an impression of it as possible. The Jia family's Hall of the Ancestors was in a separate courtyard of its own in the west part of Ningua House, away from the more domestic parts of the mansion, a courtyard that was entered through an imposing 5-frame gateway behind a black lacquered wooden paling. An inscription in large characters hung over the central arch of the gate. Ancestral Temple of the Jia Family. With a column of smaller characters in the lower left-hand part of the board indicating that the calligrapher was a direct descendant in the 60-somethingth generation of the sage Confucius. A long couplet from the brush of the same calligrapher occupied the 2 vertical boards at the arch's sides. With loyal blood poured out willingly upon the ground. A myriad subjects pay tribute to their benevolent rulers. For famous deeds lauded resoundingly to the skies. 100 generations offer sacrifices to their heroic ancestors. Inside the gate a raised white marble walk shaded by an avenue of venerable pines and cypresses led up to a terrace on which ancient bronze tripods were ranged. Over the entrance to the temple's vestibule, whose penthouse roof swept forwards from the main building's facade, hung a board framed in a carved and gilded border of 9 interlacing dragons and inscribed in the late emperor's calligraphy with the following words. His ministers are as shining stars. The vertical inscriptions on either side were in the same imperial hand. Their achievements outshone the celestial luminaries. Their fame is reflected in the generations that come after them. The board over the entrance to the main hall of the temple was framed by 2 contending dragons, and its inscription was of incised characters infilled in green. Both it and the matching couplet below it were in the calligraphy of the reigning sovereign. Honor the dead and keep their memorial. Their sons and grandsons enjoy the fruits of their blessedness. The common people recall Ning and roam with kindness. Beyond the flickering brilliance of many lights, and the glint and sheen of drapes and hangings, Bao Qin could make out some of the spirit tablets of the ancestors, but not very clearly. By ancient custom the menfolk were divided in ranks to left and right of the hall, so that each generation was on a different side from the one which followed it, fathers and sons separated, grandfathers and grandsons together. Jia Jing presided over the sacrifice with Jia Shi acting as his assistant. Cousin Jin held the drink offering, Jia Lian and Jia Tsung the silk offering, Bao Yu carried the incense, Jia Chong and Jia Ling unrolled the kneeling mat in front of the great incense burner. Then the black-coated musicians struck up and the ceremony began. The threefold offering of the cup, the standings, kneelings and prostrations, the burning of the silk offering, the libation, every movement precisely in time to the solemn strains of the music. The music ceased at the same time as the ceremony, and the participants filed out and, grouping themselves round Grandmother Jia, conducted her to the main hall of the Ningua mansion where, under the richly embroidered frieze which hung high in front of them, against a background of brilliantly decorated screens, high above the smoking incense and flickering candles of the altar, the portraits of the ancestors hung, those of the ducal siblings, Ningua and Rongua, resplendent in dragon robes and jade-encrusted belts, in the center and somewhat raised above the rest. The men ranged themselves in ascending order of seniority in the space between the hall and the ornamental gate, so that the two most junior ones, Jia Xing and Jia Ji, were just inside the gate, and the two most senior ones, Jia Jing and Jia Shi, were at the top of the terrace steps and under the eaves of the hall. The womenfolk of the family were ranged inside the hall in corresponding ranks, but in reverse order, that is to say, the most junior were nearest the threshold, and the most senior furthest inside the hall, but whereas the senior male in a generation was at the east end of his row, the senior female in the same generation would be at the west end of hers, and vice versa. The male domestics of all ages were ranged in the courtyard on the further side of the ornamental gate. The manner of making the offerings was as follows. Each course was passed from hand to hand by the servants until it reached the ornamental gate. There it was received by Jia Xing and Jia Ji, and passed on from hand to hand until it reached Jia Jing at the top of the terrace steps. Jia Rong, as senior grandson of the senior branch of the family, was permitted, alone of all the males, to stand inside the threshold with the women. He received the dishes from his grandfather Jia Jing's hands and passed them to his wife, Hushi. Hushi passed them to the row ending in Shifeng and Yushi, who passed them forwards to Lady Wang standing at the side of the altar. Lady Wang then put them into the hands of Grandmother Jia, who raised them up reverently towards the portraits before laying them down on the altar in front of her. Lady Xing stood to the west of the altar facing eastwards and helped her lay them down. When meat, vegetables, rice, soup, cakes, wine and tea had all been transmitted to the altar by this human chain, and offered up there by Grandmother Jia and her two daughters-in-law, Jia Rong withdrew, and took up his position next to Jia Qin in the courtyard below, at the head of the most junior generation of Jia family males. Now came the most solemn part of the ceremony. As Grandmother Jia, clasping a little bundle of burning joss sticks with both her hands, knelt down for the incense offering, the entire congregation of men and women, rank upon rank of them, close-packed as flowers in a flower bed, knelt down in perfect time with her and proceeded to go through the motions of the great obeisance. This was done with such silent concentration that, from 5-frame hall and 3-frame vestibule, from portico and terrace steps and courtyard, for some minutes nothing could be heard but the faint tinkling made by jade girdle pendants and tiny golden bells and the soft scrape and scuffle of cloth-soled boots and shoes. The ceremony over, Jia Jing, Jia Shi and the rest of the menfolk hurried back to the Rongua mansion, so that they could be waiting there in readiness to make their kowtows to Grandmother Jia on her return. In Yushi's main reception room, whither the ladies repaired now from the hall, the floor had been entirely covered with a great red carpet, and a huge gold cloisonné incense burner with a loach-lipped rim and 3 massive legs shaped like the trunks of elephants stood in the middle. In the center of the Kong, also new carpeted, but in scarlet, a dark red backrest had been placed with a design showing a couchant dragon coiled around the character for longevity. Large bolsters of the same color, and with the same design on them had been placed as armrests at right angles to it. For extra warmth a black fox fur had been draped around the top of it, and there was a white fox fur rug between the bolsters, for sitting on. When Grandmother Jia had been installed on this furry throne, several old great-aunts were invited to sit on fur rugs that had been spread out on the Kong to left and right of it. Lady Xing, Lady Wang and other ladies of their generation were installed on fur rugs on a smaller Kong in an alcove room to the side of the main Kong, and discreetly separated from it by an openwork wooden screen. On the floor below, in two facing rows, were a dozen carved lacquer chairs, on which Bao Qin and the other cousins were invited to sit. They had chair backs and seat covers of squirrel, and large copper foot warmers in place of footstools. Yusher and her daughter-in-law Husher now appeared with tea trays in their hands, and while Yusher offered tea to Grandmother Jia, Husher served the old aunties. After that Yusher passed into the alcove and served tea to Lady Xing and the other ladies on the smaller Kong, and Husher served the cousins sitting in chairs below. Shi Feng, Li Wan and a few other young married women of their generation, debarred from taking tea either with the elder ladies or with their young unmarried cousins, stood idly by, on the floor below the Kong, in attendance. Lady Xing and her group, as soon as they had finished drinking their tea, rose and moved over to where Grandmother Jia was sitting on the Kong so that they too might be in attendance. After exchanging a few words with the other old ladies, while she sipped her tea, Grandmother Jia gave orders for her palanquin to be made ready. At once Shi Feng climbed up onto the Kong and began helping her to her feet. "But we've already prepared dinner for you here," said Yusher. "You never stay with us for dinner on New Year's Eve. Won't you make an exception just this once? Surely my catering can't be all that inferior to Feng's?" Shi Feng continued to help Grandmother Jia from the Kong. "Come on, Granny, let's be getting home. Pay no attention to her." Grandmother Jia laughed. "You're so busy with the sacrifices," she said. "You're worked off your feet as it is. I'm sure you don't want the bother of feeding me as well. Besides, in past years when I haven't stayed, you have sent the food over to me. Why don't you do that again this year? I don't feel like eating very much now, but if you send it over, I shall be able to save it up for tomorrow, and then I shall be able to eat more of it than I could now." This made everyone laugh. "See that you get someone thoroughly dependable to sit up and keep an eye on the candles tonight," Grandmother Jia said by way of parting admonition. "Where fire is concerned, one can't afford to take chances." Yusher, escorting her meanwhile from the room, assured her that she would do so. At the pavilion gate Yusher and the other ladies hid themselves behind the gate screen from the eyes of the waiting menservants while Grandmother Jia got into her palanquin. Pages of the Ningua mansion went ahead of the bearers and, as they approached the outer gate, directed them through the center of its 3 gateways. Lady Xing and Lady Wang followed in their less imposing conveyances, accompanied by Yusher, who was also going over to the other mansion. Outside, while they were being borne in a westerly direction down the street, the ladies could see the achievements, insignia and musical instruments, bells, gongs, stone chimes and drums hung in magnificently carved, painted and tasseled stands of the Dukes of Ningua and Rongua, those of the Duke of Ningua along the eastern half of the street outside the south wall of the Ningua property, and those of his brother Duke outside the Rongua wall to its west. As in the other mansion, the center gates throughout Rongua House were all thrown open, so that a way was clear from the outer gate right through to the Hall of Exalted Felicity inside. But this time, instead of going through to the pavilion gate and getting out there, they turned left after the outer reception hall and were carried to the main reception hall in Grandmother Jia's part of the mansion. The others assembled round the old lady as they got out of their sedans and followed her into the hall. Here, too, everything had been transformed. Brilliantly embroidered screens and cushions specially brought out for the occasion, and an incense burner set down in the middle of the room from which emanated delicious odors of pine and cedar and 100 blend aromatic. As soon as Grandmother Jia was seated, a venerable nanny came up to her to report that the old ladies had arrived to make their kowtow, and she hurriedly got up again, and advanced to welcome 2 or 3 elderly female relations who had just come into the hall. A good deal of polite tussling ensued, accompanied on both sides by laughter and protestations, as Grandmother Jia took the hands of each old lady in turn and, while the old ladies pretended that they were struggling to kneel, made a great show of struggling to prevent them, for although Grandmother Jia was their senior, they were in the same generation as her and too elderly to be allowed to kowtow in earnest. They sat down for a while after that and took a cup of tea, then Grandmother Jia saw them out, but no farther than the inner ornamental gate. When she had returned and was once more enthroned on the principal seat in the hall, Jia Jing and Jia Shi came forward with all the menfolk in the family in rows behind them to make their kowtow. "You all do so much for me during the year," Grandmother Jia protested. "Can't we forget about the kowtow?" But nobody heeded her. Rank upon rank of them, the males in one large group, and the females in another, knelt down together, and bowed their foreheads to the ground. After that, folding chairs were brought and put down in a row to left and right of Grandmother Jia's seat, and the next most senior members of the family sat down, and received their kowtows, and so on by order of seniority downwards, until all but the most junior members of the family had been kowtowed to, but now even their turn arrived, and they too were allowed to sit down as the domestics of both households, men servants and women servants, pages and maids, came in by order of their various ranks and duties and made their kowtows to their employers. After that, the New Year's Eve wish penny was distributed to servants and children, gold or silver medallions in little embroidered purses, and the New Year's love feast was laid, tables on the east side of the hall for men and boys, tables on the west side for girls and women. There was herb-flavored New Year's Eve wine and love feast soup, there were lucky cakes and wish puddings, and when all had eaten and drunk, Grandmother Jia rose, and went into an inner room to change out of her court dress, which she had all this time been wearing. This was a signal for the others present to disperse. As darkness came on, offerings of cakes and burning joss sticks were made in front of all the Buddha shrines, and in all the little niches of the kitchen god, who is welcomed back this night from his annual trip aloft. In the main courtyard, outside Lady Wang's apartment, an altar to heaven and earth was set up, a long table on which offerings of sticky fried honey sticks and fresh apples and steamed wheat flour cakes and other goodies had been built up, layer upon layer, into a little pagoda of offerings in front of a large color print representing the whole host of heaven, or as much of it as the artist had been able to fit in. Great horn lanterns hung at either side of the main entrance to Prospect Garden to illuminate the gateway, and innumerable standard lamps lit up its alleyways and courtyards and walks. As for the inhabitants of the mansion, all of them, both masters and servants, seemed, in their dazzling holiday array, like walking flower gardens of brilliant embroidery and brocade. And all night long a confused hubbub of talking and shouting and laughter arose, punctuated by the continual, unceasing pops and bangs of exploding firecrackers. At 4 o'clock in the morning, as the drums of the 5th watch were sounding, Grandmother Jia and the other ladies once more got into their court dresses, and were borne in procession to the palace, this time to felicitate Yuan Chun on the advent of the new year. Liveried footmen walked ahead of them carrying the full paraphernalia, to which Grandmother Jia's rank entitled her. Once more Yuan Chun feasted them, once more, on their return from the palace, they made offerings to the ancestors in their shrine in the Ningua mansion, and once more, on returning to her own apartment in Romgua House, Grandmother Jia received the prostrations of the assembled family. As soon as that was over, she changed out of her court clothes and declared that she was going to rest, refusing to see any of the friends and relations who now began arriving in great numbers to offer their New Year felicitations, and spending her time either quietly conversing with Aunt Xue and Mrs. Li or, as an occasional diversion, playing games of cards or racing go with Bao Yu and the girls. But Lady Wang and Shi Feng, on both this and each of the 7 or 8 days which followed, were kept busy entertaining the guests whom the family had invited to drink their New Year wine. In both the reception hall and the courtyard outside it there were plays to watch and tables, at which the unending stream of visitors could sit for a while and eat and drink while they watched them. And no sooner was that lot of entertaining over than another lot had to be prepared for as the first moon waxed greater, and the lantern festival drew near. Again the Ning and Rong mansions were gay with lanterns and decorations. On the 11th of the month Jia she entertained grandmother Jia and the rest of the family, and on the 12th it was cousin Jin's turn to play host, while for several days running Lady Wang and Wang Shifeng were most of the time out visiting one or other of the innumerable families from whom they had received invitations. On the evening of the 15th grandmother Jia had tables laid for a feast in her big new reception hall, the scene of Shifeng's fateful birthday feast. A stage was set up for a troupe of child actors which she had specially hired for this occasion, and both the stage and hall were hung all over with lanterns of every imaginable shape and color. When her preparations were completed, she summoned all her children and grandchildren, nephews and nieces, great-nephews and great-nieces to a family feast. As a matter of fact, it is not strictly true that all of them were invited. Jia Jing was, for religious reasons, a total abstainer from meat and strong drink, so he was not invited. Obligations to the dead rather than to the living had brought him back for the holiday, and on the 17th, 2 days after this, as soon as the last of the ancestral sacrifices was over, he returned to his Taoist monastery outside the city and the briefly interrupted pursuit of immortality. Meanwhile, when not actually engaged in discharging ceremonial duties, he spent all the time on his own in a quiet, out-of-the-way corner of the mansion, in a state of incommunicado with the other members of the family. And Jia Shi, although he was invited, excused himself as soon as he had received a party gift from his mother. She knew that he felt uncomfortable in her presence, and did not attempt to detain him. Back in his own quarters, surrounded by cronies and dependents, he could drink and admire the lanterns while beautiful young women played and sang for his delectation. Ears with pipes and songs beguiled. Eyes by silk skirts hypnotized. A different scene altogether from the one he had just left. But let us return to the latter, to the reception hall in Grandmother Jia's rear courtyard, where a covered stage had been erected to accommodate the players. Inside the hall some dozen or more tables had been laid facing outwards towards the stage. They were arranged in a fan shape, with the 2 central tables in the place of honor at the back, and the rest of them raying out forwards to left and right of them. At the side of each table a smaller, ornamental table had been placed on which were arranged 1. A little 3-piece incense set, a vase, a cassolet, and a tripod, all made on a miniature scale out of metal, in which 100 blend aromatic, a gift from the palace, was burning. 2. A porcelain dish, 8 inches long, 4 or 5 inches wide and 2 or 3 inches deep, containing a miniature landscape made out of stones and mosses. 3. A small Japan tea tray on which was one of Grandmother Jia's best china teacups, and a little individual Millefiori teapot in which choicest tea was brewing. 4. A little table screen of red silk gauze, embroidered with flowers and appropriate lines of grass character verse, framed in a delicately carved pierced-work sandalwood frame, *. 5. A vase, each one a collector's piece, and each different from the rest, containing the 3 friends of winter or riches in a jade hall, or some other flower arrangement, mostly of fresh flowers that had been specially forced for the occasion. The 2 tables in the place of honor at the back were occupied by Aunt Xue and Mrs. Li. To their left, at the head of the row of tables radiating outwards towards the east side of the hall, there was a large, low wooden settle with a carved pierced-work back of interlacing dragons, which had been put there for Grandmother Jia to lie on. It was furnished with a backrest and bolsters, and was large enough to have a fur rug spread out on it, and still leave room at one end for a small, exquisitely gilded table of foreign make on which had been placed a teapot, a teacup, a spittoon, a napkin and, among various other small objects, an eyeglass case. Grandmother Jia rested with her feet up on the settle and, after talking for a while with the company, took out the eyeglasses from their case and looked through them at the stage. "I do hope you will forgive me for lying down like this in your presence," she apologized to Aunt Xue and Mrs. Li. "It's very rude of me, I know, but I'm getting so rheumaticy in my old age." She made Amber get up onto the settle beside her and massage her legs by gently pounding them with a maiden's fist, a sort of short-handled mallet with a padded leather head. No feaster's table with cover and drapes had been put in front of the settle, only the little ornamental table with the table screen, and the incense set and vase of flowers. The very elegant, somewhat larger table of normal height, which would have been hers if she had been sitting up with the rest, had been placed somewhat to the left of the settle, and laid with wine cups, soup spoons and chopsticks for 4. It was occupied by Bao Qin, Xiang Yun, Dai Yu and Bao Yu. Although she could not sit with them, Grandmother Jia kept up a pretense that they were eating together. Each dish as it arrived would be submitted to her inspection, and if she fancied it, would be placed on the little table at her elbow. Then, when she had tasted it, it would be removed and set down in front of the 4 young people for them to finish. After Grandmother Jia and her 4 grandchildren, the next along on the east side was Lady Xing. After her came Lady Wang, then Yushi, then Li Wan, then Shi Feng, and lastly Jia Rong's wife, Hushi. Along the west side Bao Chai came first, next to her mother, then Li Wen, then Li Qi, then Xiao Yin, then Ying Chun, then Tan Chun, and then Shi Chun. Red tasseled glass lanterns hung in rows from the beams overhead to left and right of the diners. In front of them, on each of their tables, was an ingenious light consisting of a flower-shaped candle attached to the base of a reflector in the form of a vertical lotus leaf. These lotus leaves, though made of metal, were so skillfully engraved and enameled that they looked almost real. They were attached to their metal stands by means of a swivel, so that the beams of the candle could be concentrated in any direction desired. When all the reflectors were simultaneously directed towards the stage, the diner's view of the players was wonderfully improved. The wooden partitions with their window lattices and doors, which normally separated the hall from the veranda, had been removed, and great palace lanterns of glass, whose elaborately carved wooden frames were hung with strings of crimson tassels, were suspended at intervals in the space thus created. More rows of lanterns, lanterns of every kind of material and design, horn lanterns, glass lanterns, gauze lanterns, lanterns of Yunnan glitter glass, embroidered ones, painted ones, lanterns with cutouts of paper or silk in them, hung in lines under the veranda eaves, both inside and outside the architraves, and from the eaves of the loggias on either side of the courtyard. The tables on the veranda were all occupied by males: Cousin Jin, Jia Lian, Jia Huan, Jia Tsong, Jia Rong, Jia Qin, Jia Yun, Jia Ling and Jia Chang. Although Grandmother Jia had sent invitations by word of mouth to every clansman and clanswoman residing in the city, some of them were too elderly to stand up to the noise and excitement of a party, some were unable to come because they had no one to look after the house for them while they were away, some had intended to come but were prevented from doing so by illness, some stayed away from envy of their richer clansmen, or because they were ashamed of their own poverty, others because they could not stand Shi Feng, and yet others because they were so unused to company and incapacitated by shyness that they dared not come. In short, although the clan was a numerous one, for one reason or another, of all those invited the only female guest who turned up was Lushi, mother of Bao Yu's former classmate, the intrepid little Jia Jun, who came bringing Jia Jun with her, and the only male ones were those who had found employment with the family under Shi Feng's auspices, and were therefore obliged to put in an appearance: Jia Qin, Jia Yun, Jia Chang and Jia Ling. Yet even with the absence of so many, who had been invited from outside, for a family party the company was a large one. Presently, while they all sat watching the players, Lin Jixiao's wife came into the hall leading 6 other women, each pair of whom were carrying between them a small kong table covered with a red felt top on which was a bundle of strung cash, hundreds and hundreds of newly minted copper coins, specially chosen for size and quality, fastened together by a single long cord of crimson silk. Under the direction of Lin Jixiao's wife, 2 of these tables were set down in front of Mrs. Li and Aunt Shui, and the third one beside Grandmother Jia's settle. "Do it in the middle, where everyone can see," said Grandmother Jia. The women all knew what was expected of them. Setting the tables down in the center of the hall, they simultaneously undid the ends of the crimson cords with which the money was fastened and began pulling them out so that the coins tumbled in heaps upon the tables. The play being performed on this occasion was The House in Pingkong Lane, and the actors had just come to the end of that section of it called Meeting in the Sick Room. The hero Yu Shuyi, having at last met the love of his life only to be called by stern duty from her side, had just left the stage in chagrin. At this point the child actor playing the part of his little page leopard boy, observing what was going on in the hall, began to extemporize. "You can go off in a huff if you like, but today is the 15th of the first month and old Lady Jia of Rongua House is holding a family party, so what I am going to do is to get on this horse and gallop there as quickly as I can and ask them for some sweeties." This caused Grandmother Jia and the rest of the audience to burst out laughing. "That's a sharp little fellow," said Aunt Shui. "How sweet." "And he's barely 9, said Shifeng. "Barely 9, said Grandmother Jia. "And being able to come out with it so pat." She nodded in the direction of the waiting women. Largesse. 3 of the women had already provided themselves with small shallow baskets in readiness for this order. At the word of command they walked up to the little tables, shoveled up basketfuls of coins from the heaped up money, and took them outside to the foot of the stage which Leopard Boy had just vacated. Largesse from Lady Jia, Mrs. Shui and Mrs. Li for Leopard Boy to buy himself some sweets with, said one of the women. The 3 of them then discharged the contents of their baskets upon the stage. The money landed with a mighty clatter, and at once the whole stage was covered with shining pennies. Cousin Jin had ordered his own pages to have a large flat basket of money ready for his own largesse to the players. But you will have to wait for the next volume, gentle reader, in order to find out whether they received it.